Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. It is the year 1666. London is a city teetering on the edge. Still reeling from the Great Plague that claimed a sixth of its population, it is a labyrinth of narrow, timber-framed houses, their upper floors leaning so close they almost touch. It's a city of shadows, superstition, and the ever-present smell of wood smoke and the Thames. In the early hours of a September morning, in a small bakery on a street called Pudding Lane, a single forgotten ember begins to glow. No one could know that this tiny spark was about to ignite a firestorm that would consume the medieval heart of one of the world's greatest cities, leaving an indelible scar on history. This is the story of the Great Fire of London. London, in the year 1666, was a city living on borrowed time, a medieval labyrinth teetering precariously on the edge of the modern world. Its heart was a dense, chaotic tangle of narrow, winding streets, many no wider than a single horse-drawn cart. Towering, timber-framed houses, their upper stories jettied out over the cobbled lanes below, almost touched in places, creating dark, sun-starved canyons where filth and refuse collected. The very fabric of the city was a recipe for disaster. Wooden frames were filled with wattle and daub. The exteriors were coated in flammable pitch to waterproof them, and many were still topped with volatile thatched roofs. This was a metropolis built of kindling, a sprawling fire hazard that had seen numerous major fires in its history, yet had learned little from them. The air, perpetually thick with the acrid smoke of countless coal fires and the pervasive stench of open sewers, carried the ghost of a more recent and visceral terror. The Great Plague of 1665 had just passed, a grim reaper that had scythed through the population, leaving behind a city traumatized and hollowed out. Over 70,000 souls, nearly a fifth of the city's inhabitants, had perished. The survivors walked in the long shadow of that loss, their communal resilience stretched to its breaking point, their minds steeped in a potent brew of fear, superstition, and religious anxiety, with many viewing the plague as a divine punishment. The summer of 1666 had been exceptionally long, hot, and dry, exacerbating the danger. A severe drought had gripped the land since the previous November, leaving the wooden structures of London dangerously tinder dry and brittle. Water levels in the Thames were low, and the city's rudimentary water supply system, a network of hollowed-out elm pipes, was under immense strain. An organized fire brigade was a concept for a future age. Fighting a blaze was a chaotic ad hoc affair managed by local parish constables and watchmen, armed with little more than leather buckets, primitive hand-pumped water squirts, and long fire hooks designed for pulling down buildings. This brutal tactic, creating a fire break by demolishing property, was the only effective method known, but it was a desperate, destructive measure, requiring decisive leadership and a willingness to sacrifice parts of the city to save the whole. In the dying days of August, a strong easterly wind began to blow, a persistent gale that would soon become a fatal accomplice. London, weakened by disease and built to burn, was a catastrophe waiting to happen. All it needed was a single careless spark to ignite the inferno that would not just scar the city, but reshape it forever. The story of London's destruction begins in the heart of the night, in a small, unassuming shop on a narrow street named Pudding Lane. It was here that Thomas Farriner, a baker who held the respectable title of Baker to the King, ran his business and lived with his family. In the late hours of Saturday, September the 1st, 1666, the day's work was done. Fariner, his wife, his daughter Hannah, and their manservant had retired to bed in the rooms above the bakery. A maidservant slept in her own small room. Before ascending the stairs, Fariner performed his nightly routine, checking the ovens to ensure the fires were out. He would later swear under oath that he had personally raked over the embers, confident that all was safe. Yet somewhere in the lingering heat of the bakehouse, a stray spark found life. It may have leaped from the cooling coals of the oven, or perhaps a glowing ember, thought to be extinguished, fell onto a pile of dry brushwood stacked nearby for the morning's baking. The initial flames were likely small, a quiet, insidious creep of orange against the dark wood. The fire smoldered, gathering strength in the sleeping house. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, September 2nd, the household was jolted awake, not by an alarm, but by the choking, blinding reality of thick smoke. The wooden staircase, the only conventional exit, was already engulfed in flames, cutting off their escape. Trapped and terrified, Fariner, his wife, and his daughter Hannah made a desperate choice. They scrambled out of an upstairs window and navigated their way across the roof to the adjoining house, leaping to safety. The manservant followed suit. But the maidservant, paralyzed by fear, was too afraid to make the jump across the gap. She remained behind, retreating into the burning building, and became the first recorded victim of the Great Fire of London. Down below, the fire was no longer contained. It consumed Fariner's bakery with astonishing speed, and, fanned by the strong easterly wind that whistled through the narrow lane, leaped across to the neighboring structures. The hay and fodder stored in the stables of the Star Inn next door provided a ready supply of fuel. The fire spread to the pitched-covered warehouses lining the lane, and soon the small blaze had transformed into a raging, uncontrollable beast, roaring to life in the heart of the sleeping city. As the first gray light of dawn broke on Sunday, September 2nd, it was met with a terrifying, fiery dawn of its own. The blaze that had begun in Pudding Lane was no longer a local affair. It was a rapidly expanding inferno. The strong easterly wind, a relentless engine of destruction, drove the flames westward with terrifying speed. It picked up burning embers and debris, flinging them across streets and over the tops of houses, starting new fires far ahead of the main front. This phenomenon, known as spotting, meant the fire wasn't just advancing on a single line. It was leaping and multiplying, appearing in multiple places at once and outflanking any attempt to contain it. The initial response from the city's authorities was tragically inadequate. Parish constables and local watchmen, roused from their sleep, arrived with their primitive equipment. They formed bucket chains from the few available water sources and employed small hand-operated water squirts that were pitifully ineffective against the sheer scale of the heat and flames. It was like trying to fight a dragon with a water pistol. The fire soon reached the riverside wharves and warehouses near London Bridge. This was the city's commercial heart, and it became the fire's fuel depot. These buildings were crammed with flammable goods, vast quantities of oil, tallow for candle making, coal, timber, spirits like brandy, and even gunpowder. As the warehouses ignited, they exploded in a series of catastrophic detonations, sending massive fireballs into the sky and showering the surrounding areas with yet more burning material. The firestorm began to generate its own weather system, with superheated air rising so rapidly that it created a vacuum at ground level, sucking in more oxygen and fanning the flames into an even greater fury. Panic began to grip the populace. The narrow streets became choked with a terrified exodus of citizens, desperately trying to save their families and whatever worldly goods they could carry. Carts piled high with furniture and valuables clogged the arteries of the city, creating gridlock that trapped people and hindered any organized firefighting efforts. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening roar of the fire, punctuated by the crash of collapsing buildings and the screams of the trapped. Samuel Pepys, a naval administrator and diarist, observed the chaos from a safe distance, noting in his journal the most horrid, malicious, bloody flame and the lamentable cry of the people. By mid-morning, on that fateful Sunday, the fire was burning with an unstoppable, malevolent energy, consuming the wooden city as if it were paper. In any crisis, the first hours are critical, demanding swift and decisive leadership. For London, this leadership was supposed to come from its Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth. Yet, when faced with the greatest catastrophe in his city's history, his response was one of baffling complacency and fatal indecision. Roused from his bed in the early hours of Sunday morning, he was taken to Pudding Lane to assess the situation. The fire was still relatively contained, though growing fiercely. The standard, albeit brutal procedure was clear: order the demolition of the houses in the fire's path to create a firebreak. This was a power the Lord Mayor possessed. However, upon seeing the blaze, Bloodworth uttered the infamous dismissive words that would forever seal his reputation. "Pish! A woman might piss it out." This stunning underestimation of the threat was compounded by a crippling reluctance to act. He fretted over the cost of rebuilding the demolished homes and worried about who would pay for it. He was also reportedly fearful of the homeowners, who would need to be found and convinced to allow their properties to be destroyed. This bureaucratic paralysis, this hesitation to sacrifice a few houses to save the many, was a disastrous error. While Bloodworth dithered, the fire did not. It exploded out of Pudding Lane, feasting on the dry timber and fanned by the gale-force winds, rendering his indecision catastrophic. By the time he recognized the true scale of the danger, it was far too late for simple demolitions to have any effect. The fire had grown into an uncontrollable monster. The news of the spreading inferno was carried to the court of King Charles II by Samuel Pepys. Having witnessed the fire's relentless advance and the city officials' ineptitude, Pepys took a boat to Whitehall. He gave the king and his brother James, the Duke of York, a first-hand account of the unfolding disaster, stressing that without royal intervention and the use of soldiers to enforce demolitions, the city would be lost. The king, unlike his Lord Mayor, grasped the severity of the situation immediately. He granted Pepys full authority to command Bloodworth to create firebreaks and offered the use of the Royal Life Guards. But the crucial window of opportunity had already been slammed shut by the mayor's inaction. The fire now raged with such intensity that it was beyond the control of a few men pulling down houses with hooks. The failure of leadership in those initial vital hours had sealed London's fate. The idyllic early days of their marriage were a fragile veneer over a nation simmering with discontent. The ground beneath the peacock throne was far from stable, and the tremors of revolution were growing stronger. The central figure in this seismic shift was Prime Minister Mohammad, a charismatic and fiercely nationalistic politician who became the embodiment of Iran's struggle for sovereignty. The crux of the conflict was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-owned entity that controlled Iran's vast oil reserves, giving the nation only a pittance of the profits. To the Iranian people, it was a symbol of foreign exploitation and national humiliation. Mossadegh championed the cause of nationalization, a move that would return Iran's most precious resource to its people. For the young Shah, this was a political minefield. He was caught between the overwhelming tide of public opinion supporting Mossadegh and the immense pressure from Britain and the United States, who saw nationalization as a direct threat to their interests. Soraya, now Empress, found herself in the heart of this storm. The palace, once a sanctuary of love and luxury, became a pressure cooker of political intrigue. She watched as her husband, a man still finding his footing as a monarch, wrestled with impossible decisions. She saw the lines of worry deepen on his face during late-night meetings with ministers and foreign envoys. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the political climate through the hushed conversations of courtiers and the increasingly bold headlines in the newspapers. Her role was not to govern, but to support. She became the Shah's most trusted confidant, a serene presence in a world of chaos. She listened as he vented his frustrations, offering not political advice, but the unwavering emotional anchor he desperately needed. The firestorm was no longer a distant threat. It was licking at the palace gates. When Prime Minister Mossadegh signed the oil nationalization bill into law in March 1951, it was a moment of national jubilation in Iran. But in London, the act was seen as an intolerable affront, a declaration of economic war. The proverbial London Bridge, the long-standing and exploitative relationship between Britain and Iran, was indeed burning down. The British government, led by Winston Churchill's administration, reacted with fury. They refused to accept the nationalization, viewing Mossadegh as a dangerous radical and the Shah as a weak-willed monarch unable to control his own government. The first weapon deployed was economic. The Royal Navy established a crippling blockade in the Persian Gulf, preventing any tanker from shipping Iranian oil. The world's major oil companies, under British and American influence, boycotted Iran, effectively strangling its economy. Within the palace walls, the consequences were felt immediately. State revenues plummeted, and the ambitious development projects the Shah had envisioned were put on indefinite hold. Soraya witnessed the strain this placed on her husband and her adopted country. She saw the frustration in the eyes of the people when she ventured outside the palace, a stark contrast to the adoration she had received just months earlier. The political pressure was relentless. British diplomats engaged in a campaign to isolate Iran on the world stage, painting Mossadegh as a Soviet sympathizer and a threat to global stability. Covert operations began, with MI6 agents working to destabilize the government from within, fostering dissent and funding opposition groups. Soraya, though sheltered from the grittiest details of the espionage, was acutely aware of the invisible war being waged. The atmosphere was thick with paranoia. She learned to be cautious about who she spoke to, understanding that any stray word could be twisted and used as a weapon in the escalating conflict. The crisis was no longer just about oil. It was a battle for Iran's soul, and she and the Shah were at its very epicenter. The political stalemate could not last. By the summer of 1953, Tehran was a powder keg. The British embargo had crippled the economy, and Mossadegh's popularity, once unassailable, began to fray as hardships mounted. Protests and counter-protests became a daily occurrence, turning the city's streets into a battleground for competing ideologies. The Shah, feeling increasingly marginalized and fearing a complete takeover by Mossadegh's National Front or the Communist Tudeh Party, was finally persuaded by American and British intelligence to act. He signed 2 royal decrees, one dismissing Mossadegh and the other appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi as the new prime minister. The plan was to have the Imperial Guard deliver the decree and arrest Mossadegh, a swift and decisive move to reclaim power. But the plan failed spectacularly. Mossadegh, tipped off about the plot, refused to accept the decree and arrested the colonel who delivered it. The news of the royalist plot spread like wildfire. On the morning of Monday, August 17th, the city erupted. Pro-Mossadegh and Tudeh party mobs poured into the streets, their initial target being the symbols of the monarchy. Statues of the Shah and his father were toppled and dragged through the dirt. The chants for a republic grew louder, more menacing. For Soraya and Mohammad Reza, the situation was dire. They were at their summer palace in Ramsar on the Caspian Sea when the news reached them. Their lives were in immediate danger. An infernal march of their own began, a desperate flight into exile. With only a few suitcases hastily packed, they boarded a small private plane. Soraya, clad in a simple dress, looked back at the green hills of her country, unsure if she would ever see them again. Their first stop was Baghdad, where they were received with cold formality. The world watched as the once mighty Shah of Iran and his Empress became political refugees. The crown was gone, their future uncertain. All they had was each other, adrift in a sea of political turmoil. From Baghdad, the exiled couple flew to Rome, a city that offered a degree of anonymity, but little comfort. They checked into the Excelsior Hotel, their royal status reduced to that of wealthy tourists hounded by paparazzi. The days were filled with unbearable tension. Every newspaper headline, every radio broadcast from Tehran was a source of anxiety. The news was bleak. Mossadegh seemed to be in complete control, and the world was writing the Pahlavi dynasty's obituary. Soraya did her best to maintain a brave face, to be the pillar of strength for a husband who was, by all accounts, deeply depressed and defeated. He contemplated abdication, believing his reign was over. Soraya refused to let him give up hope, reminding him of his duty and the support he still held within Iran. Meanwhile, back in Tehran, the covert operation codenamed Operation Ajax by the CIA and Operation Boot by MI6 moved into its final, decisive phase. The initial failure had been a setback, not a defeat. CIA operative Kermit Roosevelt Jr., working with General Zahedi, began to turn the tide. They used a war chest of funds to bribe politicians, military officers, and street gangs. Pro-Shah propaganda flooded the city, portraying Mossadegh as a corrupt dictator, allied with godless communists. On August 19th, just days after the Shah and Soraya had fled, the counter-coup was launched. Pro-Shah military units and hired mobs, some ironically the same ones who had toppled his statues days earlier, stormed the streets. After a few hours of intense fighting, Mossadegh's house was shelled, and he was forced to surrender. The news reached Rome like a thunderclap. The Shah was stunned, disbelieving at first, then overcome with emotion. Their exile was over. The intervention, orchestrated by foreign powers, had worked. Their return to Iran was a surreal experience. They were greeted by cheering crowds, a stark contrast to the mobs that had called for their deaths a week before. But the victory was bittersweet. The Shah was back on the peacock throne, but he was now irrevocably indebted to the foreign powers who had saved him. For Soraya, the return was a relief, but the firestorm had left its mark. She had tasted the bitterness of exile, a prelude to a fate she could not yet imagine. The year was 1958. The heart of the peacock throne was breaking, and from that fracture a queen began her long journey into the cold. The decision, though not yet public, had been made in the tear-filled, gilded rooms of the palace. For Soraya, Iran was no longer home. It was a kingdom she had to abdicate not for lack of love, but for lack of an heir. Her departure was meticulously framed as a temporary visit to her parents in Europe, a thinly veiled pretense to soften a blow that would soon shake the nation. On February 14th, a day the world associates with love, Soraya boarded a plane, leaving behind the man she still loved, the country she had served, and the title she had worn with grace. This was not a state visit. It was the beginning of an exile. The great exodus was not of a people, but of a single heartbroken woman whose personal tragedy had become a matter of state policy. As the aircraft descended, the sprawling city of Tehran, a landscape of ancient history and burgeoning modernity, shrank below. Each cloud that passed was a veil drawing across her past life. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had accompanied her to the airport. Their farewell was a portrait of silent agony, a final public performance of a bond that was being clinically severed by the demands of a dynasty. He reportedly wept as her plane disappeared into the sky. For Soraya, the flight was a surreal passage from one reality to another. She was no longer the occupant of a throne, but a passenger suspended between a life that was over and a future that was a terrifying blank. The world press was already circling, sensing the monumental story about to break. She was heading towards the cameras, the questions, and the pitying glances that would define the rest of her days. This journey was more than a geographical relocation. It was a profound displacement of her identity, the first step in her transformation from Empress of Iran to the sad-eyed princess of Europe's high society. While Soraya sought refuge in the quiet anonymity of her family's home in Cologne, Germany, the world she had left behind descended into a storm of speculation and rumor. The temporary vacation was fooling no one. The chaos began not with riots or protests, but in the whispers of the bazaars, the hushed conversations in government ministries, and soon in the bold headlines of newspapers from Paris to New York. The streets of global opinion were buzzing with the impending royal divorce. Journalists and photographers laid siege to her parents' home, turning a private sanctuary into a fishbowl. Every drawn curtain, every brief glimpse of a figure in a window was fuel for a new story. This external chaos was a brutal mirror of the internal turmoil that had consumed the royal court for months. The pressure to produce an heir had been a slow, insidious poison. It pitted the Shah's genuine love for his wife against the ancient, unyielding demand for dynastic succession. The court was a battlefield of factions. On one side were the modernists who sympathized with the royal couple's plight. On the other were the powerful traditionalists, including the Shah's formidable mother, Taj al-Muluk, and the religious establishment, for whom the continuation of the Pahlavi line was a sacred, non-negotiable duty. Their whispers were relentless, their influence inescapable. They argued that the nation's stability rested on the cradle of a male heir. For the Shah, the situation was an impossible torment. He was caught between his heart and his crown, a conflict that paralyzed him. He sent emissaries to Soraya, pleading for a compromise, floating the desperate, and for her, insulting possibility of taking a second wife. The chaos was not just in the streets of the media. It was in the heart of a king, forced to choose between his queen and his kingdom. Soraya, isolated in Germany, felt every tremor of this distant earthquake, reading about the dissection of her most intimate failure in the daily papers. Every monarchy is built on pillars of tradition, duty, and sacred unions. The marriage of the Shah and Empress Soraya was meant to be one such pillar, a grand cathedral, a St. Paul's for the Pahlavi dynasty, symbolizing a modern, romantic, and enduring future. But by early March 1958, the foundations of this institution had crumbled to dust. The fall was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, agonizing collapse brought on by the immense, unyielding pressure for an heir. The final desperate attempts to save the marriage only highlighted its irreparable fractures. The Shah's proposal that he take a second wife, a practice permissible under Iranian law but anathema to the Western-educated Soraya, was the ultimate breaking point. For her, love could not be shared. Her role as empress could not be diluted. To accept a second wife would be to accept her own defeat, to reduce their love story to a mere dynastic transaction. She refused, unequivocally. Her refusal was an act of personal dignity, but in the cold calculus of statecraft, it was the final blow. From Tehran, the message was relayed. The 25-member Imperial Council, convened by the Shah, had concluded that the welfare of the state superseded all else. The pillar had to be sacrificed to save the kingdom. The institution of their marriage, once celebrated as a fairy tale, was now being systematically dismantled by the very powers that had sanctified it. The Shah's mother and the court hardliners had won. They saw Soraya not as a beloved queen, but as a beautiful but barren vessel that had failed in her primary function. The love that the Shah and Soraya shared, genuine and deep, was ultimately powerless against the centuries-old imperatives of the crown. The fall of their St. Paul's was a profound tragedy, signaling that in the world of absolute monarchy, even the most profound love could be declared insufficient. The sacred vows had been rendered void by a silent, empty cradle, and the structure of their life together came crashing down. The crisis reached its devastating climax on a Tuesday in March. The world had been holding its breath, and now the firestorm erupted. On March 14, 1958, the official announcement was made. From the Marble Palace in Tehran, the imperial court minister, acting as the voice of the state, read a cold, formal communiqué. It stated, with profound regret, that because Empress Soraya was unable to provide an heir to the throne, the sovereign had, with the Empress's consent, agreed to a separation. The language was diplomatic, but the message was brutal. The fairy tale was officially over. That same day, the Shah himself addressed his people in a radio broadcast. His voice, usually so commanding, was heavy with emotion, breaking as he spoke of his deep affection for Soraya and his sorrow over the necessity of their divorce for the future of the monarchy. It was a rare display of public vulnerability from an absolute ruler, a king confessing his personal heartbreak to his subjects. This was the fiery peak of the tragedy, a confluence of personal anguish and global spectacle. The news flashed across wire services instantly. Soraya, who had been cloistered in her parents' home, was now the most famous divorcee in the world. The press siege intensified, with reporters shouting questions and photographers' flashbulbs exploding like mortar fire. For Soraya, the formal announcement was the final, searing confirmation of her fate. She was no longer Her Imperial Majesty, the Queen of Iran. She was now Princess Soraya, a title that felt like a consolation prize for a life that had been taken from her. The fire of public scrutiny would follow her for the rest of her life, forever branding her as the beautiful queen who was cast aside. Tuesday's fiery peak was the moment her private pain became a permanent part of public history. The climax of a love story consumed by the cold flames of duty and dynasty. The summer of 1953 was suffocatingly hot in Tehran, but the heat radiating from the political landscape was far more intense. Inside the marble palace, Empress Soraya felt the walls closing in. The power struggle between her husband, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and the fiercely popular Prime Minister, Mohammad had reached its zenith. Mossadegh had nationalized the British-owned oil industry, becoming a hero to the masses, but an enemy to the West. The Shah, backed by American and British intelligence, saw him as a threat to the monarchy itself. The air was thick with conspiracy and the scent of imminent confrontation. Soraya watched as the Shah, usually composed, paced the ornate rooms, his face a mask of anxiety and grim determination. He had decided to act, to fight fire with fire. The plan, codenamed Operation Ajax by its foreign sponsors, was to issue a royal decree, a firman, dismissing Mossadegh from power. It was a move of immense risk. On the night of August 15th, Colonel Nasiri, the commander of the Imperial Guard, was dispatched to deliver the decree to Mossadegh's home. Soraya and the Shah waited. The silence of the palace punctuated only by the ticking of clocks that seemed to measure out their destiny. Hours crawled by with no word. Then, the devastating news arrived. The plan had been leaked. Mossadegh had been waiting. Colonel Nasiri was arrested on the spot, and the coup had failed before it even began. Panic erupted within the palace. The Shah's fire had been extinguished before it could even catch. Pro-Mossadegh forces were now mobilizing, and the royal family was in grave danger. Soraya saw the look of utter defeat in her husband's eyes, a sight that chilled her to the bone. Their world, once a gilded cage of immense privilege, had suddenly become a trap with no apparent escape. The failure was catastrophic. With Mossadegh's forces closing in, the Shah and Soraya had no choice but to flee. In the dead of night, they scrambled into a small plane, the Shah himself taking the controls for part of the journey. They were monarchs on the run, their destination uncertain, their future a terrifying void. Their first stop was Baghdad, where they were received with a cool, formal hospitality that underscored their new status as political refugees. From there, they flew to Rome, checking into the Excelsior Hotel not as reigning sovereigns, but as a wealthy couple on an unscheduled holiday. The glamour of the city was a bitter irony. While tourists marveled at the Colosseum, Soraya and the Shah were glued to the radio and devoured newspapers, desperate for any news from Tehran. For several days, it seemed their reign was over. The international press declared the Shah a fallen monarch. Soraya tried to comfort her husband, who was despondent, convinced he had lost his throne forever. She saw a vulnerability in him she had never witnessed before, a man stripped of his power and his country. They were adrift, their life in exile stretching before them. But then, on August 19th, the wind turned with astonishing speed. The CIA and MI6, refusing to accept defeat, had initiated the second phase of their plan. They orchestrated protests, bribed officials, and used propaganda to turn the tide of public opinion. Pro-Shah crowds, backed by military units, stormed the streets of Tehran. After a few hours of intense fighting, Mossadegh's government collapsed. The news reached Rome, first as a rumor, then as a confirmed report. A journalist famously found the couple in their hotel room and shouted, "Your Majesty, you have your throne back." The despair that had gripped them for days evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dizzying sense of relief and triumph. Their brief, terrifying exile was over. They were going home. Their return to Tehran was a carefully staged spectacle of triumph. The streets were lined with cheering crowds, many of whom had been paid to be there, waving portraits of the Shah and Soraya. The military presence was overwhelming, a clear statement that order had been restored by force. As Soraya stepped off the plane and onto the tarmac, the familiar heat of her homeland felt different. The air was charged with a new kind of power, harsher, more absolute. They had left as fleeing monarchs and returned as victors, but the victory had come at a steep price. The democratic experiment, however flawed, was over. The embers of the coup, known as Black Wednesday, continued to smolder beneath the surface of the restored monarchy. The Shah was a changed man. The experience of near defeat and exile had hardened him, leaving him deeply suspicious and far less tolerant of dissent. He now placed his trust not in politicians or the people, but in his military and the newly formed, notoriously brutal intelligence agency, SAVAK. For Soraya, life seemingly returned to its glamorous routine. She resumed her duties as empress, attending state dinners, inaugurating hospitals, and serving as the beautiful, elegant face of the Pahlavi dynasty. The jewels were brought out of the vaults, the gowns were designed in Paris, and the international press once again celebrated her fairy tale life. Yet beneath the polished veneer, the court was a colder place. The carefree atmosphere of their early years was gone, replaced by a rigid formality and an undercurrent of fear. The coup had secured the throne, but it had also isolated it. Soraya found herself standing beside a husband who was now more of an absolute ruler than a constitutional monarch, a man whose reign was now inextricably linked to the foreign powers who had saved it. The foundation of their life together had been shaken and rebuilt on something far more brittle. With the Shah's power consolidated and his authority absolute, one issue rose above all others, casting a long, dark shadow over the palace: the succession. The Pahlavi dynasty was young, and without a male heir, the throne was vulnerable. The political stability forged in the fire of the coup demanded a clear line of succession. Suddenly, Soraya's body was no longer her own. It was an affair of state. The love and romance that had once defined her marriage were now buried under the immense, crushing weight of dynastic duty. The couple's life became a frantic, desperate search for a medical solution. The city of their love was turning to ashes, consumed by the singular focus on producing a child. They embarked on a series of medical pilgrimages, traveling to the most renowned specialists in Switzerland, France, and the United States. Each trip began with a flicker of hope and ended in disappointment. Soraya endured countless examinations, invasive procedures, and humiliating consultations. Her private struggle became public speculation. Whispers in the court grew louder, and newspaper articles delicately hinted at the problem facing the Empress. The Shah, though initially supportive, grew increasingly strained. The pressure from his mother, the formidable Taj ul-Muluk, and from government hardliners was relentless. They saw Soraya not as a beloved wife, but as a beautiful but barren obstacle to the future of Iran. The intimacy she shared with her husband was corroded by the clinical nature of their quest. Their conversations were dominated by ovulation cycles, medical reports, and the palpable anxiety of another month passing without success. Soraya felt a profound sense of failure and isolation. She was the Empress of Iran, surrounded by unimaginable luxury. Yet the one thing the crown demanded of her, she could not provide. Her love for the Shah was still strong, but it was being systematically dismantled by the cold, impersonal demands of the throne. In the smoldering aftermath of the Great Fire, London was a city consumed not only by flames, but by fear and paranoia. Grief and rage demanded a target, a simple explanation for an incomprehensible catastrophe. The official narrative, that the fire was an act of God punishing a sinful city, was not enough for a populace steeped in anti-Catholic and anti-foreigner sentiment. They needed a human face to blame, a villain to punish. That face belonged to Robert Hubert, a simple-minded French watchmaker. Hubert was apprehended in Essex, attempting to flee to France. Under interrogation, he confessed to starting the fire as an agent of the Pope. His story was a tapestry of convenient lies and tragic absurdities, eagerly accepted by a city desperate for a scapegoat. He claimed to have thrown a fireball through the window of the bakery on Pudding Lane, aided by a small team of accomplices. The problem, however, was that Hubert had not even been in London when the fire began. He had arrived by ship 2 days after the blaze was already raging. Furthermore, he was physically disabled and would have been incapable of throwing a grenade with any accuracy. The owner of the bakery, Thomas Farriner, testified that his bakery had no windows facing the street, making Hubert's primary claim impossible. Yet, none of this mattered. The political climate, charged by recent wars with the Dutch and French, required a foreign Catholic culprit. Hubert's confession, however flawed, was the key that locked the cell door. The Lord Chief Justice, aware of the inconsistencies, noted that the man's confession was so detailed that he could not be disbelieved, a grim testament to the power of narrative over fact. Hubert was swiftly tried, convicted on his own shaky testimony, and sentenced to hang. On the 27th of October 1666, he was taken to Tyburn and executed. It was only after his death that the captain of the ship he had sailed on came forward with definitive proof that Hubert could not have been the arsonist. The truth was an inconvenient postscript to a politically necessary fiction. Robert Hubert became the fire's final, tragic victim, a symbol of a city's frantic and fatal search for someone to blame. Once the last embers were extinguished, the true scale of the apocalypse that had befallen London was laid bare. For days, the city had been a roaring inferno, an ocean of flame that had consumed everything in its path. Now, it was a silent, monochrome wasteland of ash and rubble, punctuated by the skeletal remains of stone buildings. Diarists John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, our eyes on the ground, walked through the ruins in a state of shock and disbelief. Evelyn described the ground as being so hot it burned the soles of his shoes, and the air thick with a choking sulphurous smoke. He wrote of melted church bells, shattered glass fused into strange new forms, and the ghostly outlines of streets that no longer existed. The numbers were staggering. The fire had devoured over 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, St. Paul's Cathedral, and most of the city's official buildings. An area of 136 acres, the very heart of the medieval city, was utterly obliterated. The economic toll was catastrophic. The Royal Exchange, the center of commerce, was a ruin. Guildhall was gone. Countless businesses, workshops, and warehouses filled with valuable goods had vanished into smoke, taking with them the livelihoods of thousands. But the devastation was most profoundly human. An estimated 100,000 Londoners were now homeless, their lives and possessions reduced to what little they could carry. They fled to the fields surrounding the city, Moorfields, Finsbury, and Islington, setting up vast, sprawling encampments. Here, amidst makeshift tents and lean-tos, the social fabric of the city was stretched to its breaking point. Rich and poor alike were refugees, huddled together against the autumn chill, facing an uncertain future. King Charles II, witnessing the squalor, arranged for naval biscuits and other provisions to be distributed. A small gesture against an ocean of need. This was not just the destruction of property. It was the erasure of a world. Generations of history, culture, and memory, all incinerated in 4 terrifying days, leaving behind a scarred landscape and a traumatized populace to survey the wreckage of their lives. From the ashes of destruction rose an unprecedented opportunity for creation. The obliteration of medieval London, with its labyrinthine alleys and overcrowded timber-framed houses, presented a blank canvas. Within days of the fire being extinguished, visionaries and architects began submitting ambitious plans to King Charles II for a modern, reimagined capital. Among them was the brilliant 34-year-old professor of astronomy at Oxford, Christopher Wren. Wren, who had already displayed a keen interest and talent in architecture, saw a chance not merely to rebuild, but to completely redesign London along the rational, elegant lines of continental capitals, like Paris and Rome. His vision was breathtaking in its scope. He proposed a city built on a grid plan, with wide, straight boulevards radiating from grand piazzas. These avenues would cut through the old street plan, connecting key landmarks like the Royal Exchange and St. Paul's Cathedral. The new city would be one of light, air, and order, a stark contrast to the dark, cramped, and unsanitary conditions that had contributed to the spread of both plague and fire. Wren envisioned a city built for commerce and convenience, with a magnificent stone quay running the length of the Thames, replacing the chaotic jumble of private wharves. His London would be a symbol of English power and enlightenment, a Baroque masterpiece born from a Gothic tragedy. He presented his detailed plans to the king just over a week after the fire. Charles II was impressed by the elegance and ambition of Wren's proposal. However, the dream of a completely new London quickly collided with the harsh realities on the ground. The city needed to be rebuilt quickly to prevent merchants and craftsmen from relocating permanently. More critically, the old system of property rights was a legal minefield. Every plot of land, no matter how small, was owned by someone, and redrawing the entire map would have meant endless disputes and compensation claims. Landowners, eager to rebuild their homes and businesses, resisted any plan that would deprive them of their ancestral plots. Ultimately, the urgent need for a swift reconstruction trumped the desire for a perfect one. Wren's grand vision was set aside, and London was rebuilt largely upon its old medieval footprint. But the exercise was not in vain. It had announced the arrival of a monumental talent who would, in a different way, stamp his genius all over the city's skyline. Though Christopher Wren's grand, sweeping redesign was never realized, the Great Fire of London was nonetheless a profound catalyst for change, forging a new city and a lasting legacy. The immediate priority was to ensure such a disaster could never happen again. Parliament passed the Rebuilding Act of 1667, a landmark piece of legislation that fundamentally altered the character of London. The act mandated that all new buildings be constructed of brick or stone, not flammable timber. It regulated the thickness of walls and set limits on the height of buildings. Streets were required to be wider, improving sanitation and creating natural fire breaks. This was the birth of modern urban planning in England, a direct response to catastrophe that made London a safer, healthier, and more resilient city for centuries to come. The architectural legacy, of course, became the most visible symbol of London's rebirth. The task of rebuilding the city's 87 destroyed parish churches fell largely to one man, Christopher Wren. Over the next 4 decades, he and his office designed and oversaw the construction of 51 new churches, each a unique masterpiece of English Baroque architecture. His work culminated in the magnificent new St. Paul's Cathedral, its iconic dome rising from the city's ashes to dominate the skyline, a testament to faith and endurance. Beyond the stones and mortar, the fire spurred innovation. The devastation of property led to the birth of the modern insurance industry, as entrepreneurs like Nicholas Barbin established the first fire insurance companies. Economically, the rebuilding effort was a massive stimulus, providing work for thousands of craftsmen and laborers. To commemorate the event, Wren and his colleague Robert Hooke designed the monument, a towering Doric column near Pudding Lane. For generations, its inscription blamed the fire on a popish frenzy, a political scar that remained long after the physical ones had healed. London had lost its medieval heart, but from the embers, a new, more robust, and recognizably modern city emerged, its character and skyline forever shaped by the legacy of the Great Conflagration.